Good afternoon and welcome to today's Georgetown Alumni webinar sponsored by the Georgetown University Alumni Association. Thank you for taking time out of your day to connect virtually with fellow Hoyas for today's webinar, Hamlet, a play with, without a hero. Today's presenter, Michael Collins, is a professor of English at Georgetown University. He teaches courses on Shakespeare and modern British drama. He came to Georgetown as Dean of the School for Summer and Continuing Education, and after 22 years as Dean, he joined the Department of English. Professor Collins has also served as director of the Villa le Balze, Georgetown's study center in Florence, Italy. He has written reviews of Shakespeare in performance and essays on teaching Shakespeare. His daughter, Deanne, graduated from Georgetown in 1989, and his granddaughter, Sophia, is currently a junior in the college. I'm Kelly Young, Associate Director of Strategic Engagement in Alumni Relations, and I'll be facilitating today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few tips and reminders. This broadcast is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel within 48 hours after today's discussion. You will receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email, which will also contain a post-program survey, information on upcoming virtual events, and more ways to stay connected to the Hilltop. Professor Collins will answer questions at the end of the presentation. Please send in your questions as you have them using the questions section of the webinar control panel. If you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, please also submit those concerns to me via the questions section of that control panel. Without any further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Professor Michael Collins.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for that kind introduction. I should add to it something I did not include is that my son-in-law is also a Georgetown graduate, class of 1988, as well as business school, and also a graduate of the law school. If I don't get that in, he'll be angry at me for getting him and including him in our Georgetown family. So in any case, I'm going to talk about Hamlet in 45 minutes, which is probably a great disservice to the play. And so I'll only be able to focus on one of the many, many elements in the play. But I'll try to do that as well as I can and to make some sense of the play from at least one point of view. So you have access to some handouts, some lines from the play, a couple of other things that we might refer to as we go along this afternoon. So we'll begin now. There are, as you may know, three versions of Hamlet. Two of them were published during Shakespeare's lifetime and one after his death. The first one is the so-called quarto, a small paperback edition of the play, was published in 1603. A second quarto version was published in 1604. And then the third version of Hamlet appears in the folio, the first folio that was assembled by some of the surviving members of Shakespeare's acting company after his death in 1616. The first folio was published in 1623, and that contains a third version of Hamlet. All of these Hamlets are different, one from the other. Not sometimes in significant ways, at other times in very minor ways. For example, when Hamlet says in the quarto, "Oh, that this too sullied flesh should melt," in the folio, he says, "Oh, that this too solid flesh should melt." So there are a lot of small differences in the three versions. To go back for a minute, and I know that, as I always say to my students, quartos and folios a little bit goes a long way. But there's a couple of things we have to kind of get settled before we move on, because we'll talk about this at the end of the play in the context of some of its meanings. So the quarto of 1603 is what is called a bad quarto. Nobody pays much attention to it when putting together a reading text of Hamlet. If you read the third soliloquy, the famous to be or not to be soliloquy, in the first quarto of 1603, it sounds like it's being played back through an idiot tape recorder. It's a so-called memorial reconstruction, which means that a couple of actors, not the one who played Hamlet, but a couple of actors probably sat down with a printer and tried to, by memory, put the play together for publication. But the 1604 quarto, the so-called second quarto, is a good one. And many scholars rely on the second quarto when they're putting together a modern edition of the play. That would be their base text, and the folio would provide some amendments and corrections from time to time. And then, although other scholars depend upon the folio as their base text, and then take readings from the quarto to supplement the folio. One significant difference between the quarto and the folio is that the fifth soliloquy, how all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge, the fifth quarto is not the fifth quarto, the fifth soliloquy is cut from the folio edition of 1623. Maybe just to be sure, I should make clear, the folio is a collected edition of Shakespeare's plays. It has 36 of the 37 plays we now ascribe to Shakespeare, gathered together by John Hemmings and William Condell, two members of his acting company, in 1623, 7 years after his death. So anyway, the folio edition, among other things, cuts the fifth soliloquy. There are other differences as well. Once upon a time, what an editor who was creating a text for readers like us would try to create a conflation of the two versions. He or she might have some conception of what the ideal Hamlet was, and by using the quarto and folio and merging them in certain ways, those ways determined by the sensitivity and the scholarly conclusions of the editor, would put together the so-called conflated edition of Hamlet. Maybe 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago now, scholarship changed. And in the case of Hamlet, as in the case of King Lear, scholars began to think that the quarto and the folio ought to be considered as separate and discrete plays. So, for example, if you buy an edition of the Norton Anthology of Shakespeare, you will find that it contains a copy of the quarto, a copy of the folio, and a conflated edition. But for some scholars, it is very important to see those two versions, quarto and folio, as distinct editions. Now, or I should say, distinct versions of the play. Why? We'll talk about that in a little bit of time. So that's a little bit of the background we're going to need as we go forward, thinking about the play. Remember, if you read the description of this webinar, it says it's a play with or without a hero, and maybe the answer to that question, is it a play with a hero, without a hero? Maybe the answer to that question resides in a consideration of the two versions of the play. All right, so we go forward. Anyway, Hamlet is a revenge play. And if you look at the material that you have that came with the webinar, you'll see the first sheet there is something called Characteristics of Revenge Tragedy. It's a long description, and I'll leave it to you to read for yourself at another time. But I want to look at the fourth paragraph for a minute. What are the characteristics of a revenge tragedy? A ghostly, fourth paragraph. A ghostly visitation of the murder victim to a younger kinsman, generally a son. Sounds familiar. Sounds like Hamlet. A period of disguise, intrigue or plotting in which the murderer and the avenger scheme against one another, with a slowly rising body count. Polonius, Ophelia, and finally, the end. A descent into either real or feigned madness by the avenger. One of the great questions is Hamlet mad or is he not mad? I contend he is not mad, because he says, I'm going to look like I'm mad, but I won't really be mad. But in any case, the question is the madness real or feigned in Hamlet? Madness by the avenger or one of the auxiliary characters, an eruption of general violence at the end, often accompanied, it says, by means of a feigned mask or festivity. And the festivity at the end of Hamlet, of course, is the duel in which Hamlet, Laertes, the king, and Gertrude all die. A catastrophe, I just described it, utterly decimates the dramatic persona. So that is a fair description of Hamlet. It is a revenge play. And that too will figure into our consideration when we try to finally to answer the question, is Hamlet a hero or is he not? A couple of things about the revenge play is this. There's always a tension in all revenge stories. If you read, for example, Murder on the Orient Express, the people murder the 12 people, forming a kind of jury on the train, murder the murderer who has escaped justice in the courts, and Poirot is faced with the dilemma, do I enforce the law? The law must be enforced. It is necessary to have laws to create a civil society. Or shall I allow these people who have had their own kind of justice, revenge, if you like, who have created their own kind of justice in murdering the murderer on the train, shall I let them go free? There's always in these revenge plays, these revenge stories, the tension, say, between justice and the law. The law fails, the revenger, the actors seek to bring justice where the law has failed. And that's true in Hamlet. It is true in contemporary tellings of the story. That was my phone. I apologize. So we haven't got a lot of time, so we'll move along pretty quickly now, and we'll take a look at the third soliloquy, the famous "to be or not to be" soliloquy, and that will get us on our way in our consideration of Hamlet. As you know, a ghost appears first to the soldiers and to Horatio on the battlements in the first scene, and they inform Hamlet that they have seen his father's ghost on walking around at night. Hamlet goes out to meet the ghost, and the ghost reveals to him that his uncle Claudius, that is Hamlet's uncle Claudius, brother to the ghost, the elder Hamlet, has murdered him while sleeping in his orchard. And he does what all ghosts do in these revenge stories. He commands Hamlet to revenge his death. He says, leave her to heaven, that is Gertrude, Hamlet's mother. And that's another story about Hamlet we could tell, his relationship with Gertrude, but we will not. We'll stay where we are. But the ghost says, avenge my murder. And so now, Hamlet now is tasked with or has to carry out the revenge. But as everybody knows, he famously hesitates. Why? Well, he's afraid this ghost, at least that's what he said, this ghost might be an evil ghost sent by the devil to entrap him, to damn him. And so he feels that he needs to find out what is going on with the ghost. He needs to see if what the ghost has spoken is indeed true. All right, now let's take a look at the third soliloquy. That too, you have a copy of that in the material. And if you want to follow along, you may know it by heart. It's a very famous speech, of course, but if you want to follow along, let's read it. To be or not to be, that is the question. And it begins like a kind of a proposition in debate. To be or not to be. We'll argue, is it better to live or die? That is the question with which we are concerned. Whether 'tis, now the elaboration of the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of trouble, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the natural heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. If we die, we release ourselves from the suffering that is an inevitable part of the human condition. Now, of course, Hamlet is not particularly not in particularly good spirits at this time in the play, and perhaps you might judge he sees the darkness of the world as even more darker than it actually is. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, to sleep. Perchance to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil? What dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. Because we pause, we don't commit suicide, end it. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurs that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus take with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. It's like a stream being diverted. Their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. At that point, he either sees or Ophelia or she enters. So there's the soliloquy, to be or not to be, and it's a kind of a meditation. But let's go back on that for a minute, because there's two things there. One that is kind of odd, I think, because he says, who would fardels bear burdens to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, the fear puzzles the will, keeps it from taking action, and makes us bear the fardels. Wait, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. He just saw a ghost. A traveler has returned. Now, why does he say that? It doesn't make any sense. Shakespeare forgot the ghost. No, I don't think so. I think Shakespeare knew very well that there was a ghost floating around, and he gives those lines to Hamlet. Now, we must remember Shakespeare is not a particularly consistent writer in the sense that he trusts the stage, he trusts the theater, and he trusts the fact that audiences live in the present. And so if things that happened before are going to happen after happen, that doesn't concern him because he has an instinct of what will go down and be acceptable in the theater. So it's probably not a mistake. There's another reason for it. Let's let that go for a second and come back to another issue in that soliloquy. He says, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all. But watch how now the soliloquy begins to drift away from the question of suicide, should I kill myself, should I not kill myself, and becomes more generalized. Really, any great decision, any decisions we have to make, to do it or not to do it, to do this and not to do that. He says, enterprises of great pith and moment, with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. He seems not so much talking about, it's that the will is puzzled because it cannot know what the future holds. In the case of to be or not to be, to live or die, but also in the case of any decision of serious consequence, because we cannot know what the future brings. We cannot know the implications of our choices because we cannot know what will happen as a result of the things we do. The native hue of resolution is sickly o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment, making decisions, lose the name of action. With this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. What starts out as a soliloquy, shall I kill myself or not kill myself? Is it better to live or die? Well, we don't know, and therefore we hang on here, becomes a larger question. When it comes to decision making, we don't know the future, and therefore the great enterprises that we would undertake, we don't undertake because we don't know what the future holds. So now back to the ghost. Well, why does Shakespeare forget about the ghost? One possibility is because he's not interested in the ghost. He's not interested really in the revenge tragedy, in the story of the revenge. What he's interested in is Hamlet's psyche, Hamlet's existential condition of having to make choices. That's the great existential problem. We must make choices, even though we don't have the full context to make our choices. Maybe what the ghost is not helpful in that situation. Hamlet has to be put in a world that is like the world in which we live. As I always say to my students, has any ghost come by lately to tell you what to do? Has any angel come down from God to tell you what to do? No. In order to figure out what you have to do, you have to figure it out for yourself. Nobody tells you. Now, in revenge tragedy, what the ghost says has to be obeyed. It is truth. The conventions of the revenge tragedy, it's the truth. The ghost tells the truth, and the orders of the ghost have to be obeyed. But Shakespeare doesn't seem to be interested in the revenge tragedy at this point. He sort of forgets about the ghost, so that the focus falls on Hamlet, who is now living in a world like ours, living in a world where there are no ghosts to tell us what to do, living in a world where he has to figure out how to act without having all the necessary information. Enterprises of great picture moment turn awry and lose the name of action, because he does not have, because we live in mystery and we do not have the information that we need to make an absolutely correct, foolproof decision. Hamlet is now living in a world like our own without the ghost. All right, so what does Hamlet do? Hamlet decides he's got to test this ghostly apparition and find out if the ghost is in fact a good ghost, if you like, not the devil, not a devilish ghost who's trying to lead him to hell. The ghost, he's got to test the ghost, sorry. And so how does he do it? He decides to carry out some empirical experiments, or at least one empirical experiment. He gets in order to verify the ghost, he gets the players to add a few lines and a few actions to the play that they're going to put on to stage what has come to be called the Mousetrap. And of course, the idea of the Mousetrap is the players will play a play that replicates what the ghost has told him about his own murder. And the king, who has committed the murder, will see the replication in the play, and then his guilt will become apparent. And so that's what Hamlet does. He gets Horatio. They're going to watch the king's response when he sees played out the murder that he has, a murder just like the one he has committed. So, and it's the murder of the king by Lucianus, Hamlet says, nephew of the king. The play goes on. The king is watching, and all of a sudden the king stands up. It's usually played that way. The king stands up and says, "Give me some light." And Polonius says, "Give all the play." Hamlet says, "We've got him." You see, his guilty conscience, he says to Horatio, made him lose it. That's not a technical word. Made him, it touched him, and he was disturbed by it. He jumped up, "Give me some light." He runs off the stage. Evidence. But now, we take that as evidence because we know the king is guilty. He's already confessed to us, the audience, in an aside. But Hamlet doesn't know that, but he takes it as evidence that the king committed the murder. But think about it for a minute. Here's the king sitting in the dark, watching a king getting murdered by his nephew, Lucianus, while meanwhile, in the dark, his own nephew is running around acting as if he's insane, talking dirty to Ophelia, and generally being disruptive. And the king has had uneasy feelings about Hamlet up until this point. So why does he stand up and give me some light? Not because his conscience has been touched by the play, but because in the play he has seen the possibility of his own murder that very moment by Hamlet. Give me some light so he can be protected from this crazy nephew running around in the dark. Now, so you see, now again, everybody takes it, a confession of guilt. But it need not be that. That evidence that Hamlet gathers is ambiguous. So it can be interpreted one way, it can be interpreted another way. What is truth? Hamlet gets lucky. He guesses the right answer. But it could be interpreted another way, and the consequences. And if you base your choice, your decision, your action on that interpretation, well, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. Then more evidence. The king is at prayer, and Hamlet comes by and finds the king at prayer. And so Hamlet says, "Now might I do it, Pat." He said, "Now I can murder the king and everything, and have the vengeance that I have been told to take on the king, and also to have the vengeance that and to know exactly that I'm sorry. I was trying to check the time and I can't, so I will slow down for 1 second. I apologize. He says, "Now I have the evidence. Now I can kill the king and carry out the revenge that I have been ordered to do." But then he says, wait, but the king is at prayer. If I kill him at prayer, he will go straight to heaven. He says, this is salary and hire, not revenge. I'm sending him to a better place. So he doesn't murder the king at that point, or kill the king. He goes off the stage to his mother's dressing room. Meanwhile, the audience discovers that he has been unable to pray, that he's been saying the prayers, but he cannot make the connection to heaven. His prayer, he feels, or he can't pray the king. And so Hamlet, again, draws the wrong assumption from the evidence presented to him. The king in the position of prayer, but being unable to pray. All right. So Hamlet goes off to Gertrude's bedroom. He mistakenly kills Polonius, thinking that Polonius is the king hiding in the bedroom, and then is sent off to England. And on his way to England, he meets the army of Fortinbras, another nephew bent on vengeance, who is making his way to Poland to evade Poland. Now we'll look at that scene a little bit in a minute or so, but maybe this is time to talk a little bit about the play. There's a book, wonderful book, written by a man named James Shapiro, who teaches at Columbia, has written a number of books on Shakespeare, and is probably one of the two best commentators, particularly for commentators on Shakespeare, and for people who are not Shakespeare scholars. The other is Stephen Greenblatt. They're both fine scholars, excellent scholars, but they also write for people like you and me, who just are interested in Shakespeare. So in any case, I'm leaning into James Shapiro's book called 1599, A Year in the Life of Shakespeare. Shapiro has a new book just came out about Shakespeare and the Civil War. But in any case, in this book, 1599, James Shapiro poses a theory about Hamlet. Now, and the theory is this: the quarto version and the folio version, remember? Okay, the theory is this: the folio version is a revision of the quarto version. Why is it a revision? Because when Shakespeare wrote the quarto version, he was focused on, as we said, Hamlet's psyche, Hamlet's existential need to make a decision, Hamlet's character, if you like, his existential dilemma, his character. And as a result, says Professor Shapiro, the revenge plot started to get away. You see, a revenge tragedy has a certain set of conventions, one of which is that the avenger work his way through the play and finally take revenge. But in the quarto, Hamlet famously delays, doesn't carry out the vengeance, and spends a lot of time, as we saw, trying to read the signs, figure out what he should do, put on a play, and so on. So for whatever the reason, according to Professor Shapiro's theory, Shakespeare wanted to tighten up the play and put more emphasis on the plot and less on character, more emphasis on the action and less on the deliberation. The plot requires that the avenger carry out the task at hand, which is revenge, and the focus of a revenge tragedy is not on the psyche of the revenger, but on the action, the plot of the play. So it's character, plot, action, deliberation. So what did Shakespeare do? He revised the play in order to make more apparent, to make tighter, if you like, the revenge plot. Now, what's the evidence? Well, there is some evidence, but it's not particularly compelling, at least not in my judgment. There's a very straightforward reason why the Fifth Soliloquy was cut. Hamlet is a very long play. At some point, the play was played without the Fifth Soliloquy. The copy that was preserved by Shakespeare's company in its library was the copy without the Fifth Soliloquy. When Hemmings and Condell needed a copy of Hamlet to go in the first folio, they took the one off the shelf without the Fifth Soliloquy, and that's why it got printed in the first folio. It's a version of the play with the Fifth Soliloquy cut. Did Shakespeare cut it? Who cut it? Did the stage manager cut it? It's a long play. The people for whom we're putting it on, perhaps in somebody's great hall, don't want it to run quite that long. All right, we'll cut the Fifth Soliloquy. That's as plausible an argument, probably, as the revision argument. There's a wonderful long harangue by a man named Ron Rosenbaum, who wrote a book called The Shakespeare Wars, who just excoriates James Shapiro for suggesting that he knows Shakespeare's mind and that Shakespeare would cut such a remarkable soliloquy in order to cut it out in order to kind of change the character or the shape of the play. He just doesn't believe it. But anyway, let us assume that Professor Shapiro is correct, and the soliloquy was cut. Let's take a look at that Fifth Soliloquy, if you would. Yes, we're okay with the time. Take a look at the Fifth Soliloquy. You have a copy of it. Actually, you have a copy of all of Act 3, Act 4, Scene 4 is what it is, and you have the whole thing with you. I've got to find mine. 4544. Here we go. So Hamlet's on his way to England, and he meets the army of Fortinbras. And it begins, "Go, Captain, greet me from the Danish king. Tell him that by his license, Fortinbras craves conveyance, and so on and so forth." Fortinbras goes on, and the captain says, "I will do it, my lord." Fortinbras says, "Go softly on." Boom. That's where the scene ends in the folio. But in the quarto, it continues. Whose power? And because Hamlet talks to the captain who remains behind. "Good sir, whose powers are these?" "They are of Norway." And they talk about that. And the captain, and he says, and Hamlet asks, "Well, what's going on here?" Truly to speak, and with no addition, we go to gain a little patch of ground that hath in it no profit but the name. To pay 5 ducats, 5, I would not farm it. nor will it yield to Norway or the Pole a ranker rate should it be sold in fee. It's not worth anything, and you couldn't sell it for any more. What? Hamlet says. Then the Polo will never defend it. Yes, says the captain. It is already garrisoned. You see, Hamlet never went to the School of Foreign Service and learned anything about international relationships and the way things work. Yeah, of course. It's worthless. It's already garrisoned. Fortinbras wants it. The Poles don't want to give it up. It's worthless, but something is going on there. She said, well, the Polo, so Hamlet has 2,000 souls and 20,000 ducats will not settle the question of this straw. And then begins, there's a little more there, but we don't really have time to look at it, but then begins the Fifth Soliloquy. Now, why does the Fifth Soliloquy have to be cut? Because it's another of those soliloquies, another one of those moments in the play, I guess, where Hamlet is deliberating. And although he sounds like he's trying to commit himself to vengeance, he doesn't really succeed, because what's running through his mind is the absurdity of human affairs, public events, revenge, murder, war, politics. It's all absurd and meaningless. That's what's going on through his mind. How all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast, no more. Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. Now, whether it be bestial oblivion, or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which quartered hath but one part wisdom and ever 3 parts coward, I do not know why yet I live to say this thing's to do, since I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. Examples gross as earth exhort me. Witness this army of mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, whose spirit with divine ambition puffed makes mouths at the invisible event. Remember the fear of something after death. It's tying back to the other soliloquy, that the future, Fortinbras isn't worrying about the future. Led by a delicate tender prince, whose spirit with divine ambition puffs, makes mouths, not worried about the future at the invisible event, exposing what is mortal and sure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. You see, we don't know what's going to happen, but he's willing to take the risk because he's the man of action. Hamlet is the man of deliberation. What are the consequences? What will happen? How many will get killed in this enterprise? Now, the cynicism. Rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument. That's how what greatness is. Not to stir, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honor's at the stake. How stand I then? That have a father killed, a mother stained, excitement of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep, while to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men. Now we're back thinking, no, these people are going to be killed. Action has been taken, but what value, what purpose does it have? For a fantasy and trick of fame, go to their grave like beds, fight for a plot whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. But then he says, oh, from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or nothing worth. My thoughts be bloody or nothing worth, but that's not what happens. he keeps in that soliloquy where he tries to create his, to get himself motivated to commit the murder. He's actually, again, finding reasons not to do it, finding that this action has a fundamental absurdity, destructive absurdity to it. So Professor Shapiro says we cut that out, we cut that out because it gets in the way of Hamlet's now moving more directly to revenge. One counter argument to Professor Shapiro's argument is they didn't cut the graveyard speech scene where Hamlet is even more deliberative and reflective. But who could ever bring himself to cut the graveyard scene? All right, there's one last piece, and I know we've got only about 2 minutes. So if you would look at with me for a minute, it says on the sheet, Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 2. Okay. As you know, Hamlet dies in the duel. They set up the king and Laertes set up the duel with the poisoned foils and so on. And just before the duel begins, Horatio says to Hamlet, look, if you have any reservations about this duel, forget it. We'll call it off. Don't go on with it. And then Hamlet says these words. It says, Hamlet on your sheet, Act 5, Scene 3, Quarto 2, Folio 2. Not a whit, he says, we defy augury. We're not going to try to predict the future. Remember, it's all going back. What's the future going to be? At this point, we defy augury. Why? This is my reading. There's a special providence in the fall of the sparrow. And it's an allusion to Matthew chapter 10. The apostles are worrying about what's going to become of them. And Jesus says to them, don't worry. God takes care of sparrows. God will take care of you. You are more important than sparrows. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be not now, if it be now, 'tis not to come. Death. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. Readiness is all. Be ready for death. Since no man has aught of what he leaves, what is it to leave betimes? To leave early, to go away. Since no man to die, no man has aught of what he leaves. Essentially, you can't take it with you, so what does it matter? You don't have anything that you leave behind. And so, but watch Quarto 2. Remember, the more contemplative, the more thoughtful, the Hamlet who is confronting the existential realities of a human life, the fact that we live in mystery. Not a whit, we defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be, it is not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man of aught he leaves knows, what is it to leave betimes? Let be. To be or not to be, let it be. Let be. Choose life. Live. Why? Because there's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. Because, at least this is, I think, there are other readings of these lines, but I think this is what Hamlet means. What he means is there is a special providence. God will watch us. God has a plan. Things do in this world come right. Hamlet's made an act of faith. The play has not necessarily made an act of faith, nor has Shakespeare, but Hamlet has made an act of faith. He trusts the world. Things come right. Let be. Be ready. Why? We live in mystery. We can't know anyway. since no man of aught he leaves knows. We don't know the truth of the human condition. All we must is be ready and to act. Readiness to act, readiness to die when the time comes. Let be. Trust. Trust that things come right. So Hamlet has solved his problem. Not in any way but in the only human way possible. We live in mystery. We have to make choices within that mystery, make choices without the knowledge we need to make those choices. Hamlet has found his way of dealing with mystery. The play asks us, in a sense, how will we deal with the mystery? I thought that to bring this home, how do we solve these? How do we answer the human questions we face? If you're a doctor or a nurse, who gets the respirator? And I'll stop there, I think.
Wow, what a note to stop on. Professor Collins, thank you so much. I truly feel like I was taken right back to my time as an undergraduate student in your classroom this afternoon. What a treat for all of those who joined us. Thank you. And I do want to remind everyone that you do have the opportunity to ask any questions you have through the questions section of the control panel. So feel free to type in any questions you have. We have gotten some others echoing their thanks for your doing this today, Professor Collins.
Thank you.
And we do have a couple questions. So one is, do you believe that Hamlet and Ophelia's relationship is a true one throughout the play?
I can't resist telling Laurence Olivier's joke, although I don't think it was original with him. Someone asked him, do you think Hamlet and Ophelia have consummated their relationship? And Olivier said, yes, in every production I've ever been in, they have. But I think that's, again, one of those choices that an actor or a set of actors make about it. When he says, I did love you once, or it seems to me in that Act 3, Scene 1 that follows the soliloquy, yes, I think I don't think he's using her or anything like that. I think I would play, if I were going to play it, I would play it that there is something genuinely, they share love, if you like. They're in love with one another. There's affection. Interesting that Polonius, the father, is as fathers always are, worried about his daughter and her relationship with Hamlet. While at the same time, Gertrude says, I had hoped that Ophelia would make a wife to Hamlet at her grave. And so I think I would say, if I were going to play it, I would play it as they are in love, and the death of the father and the turmoil in the court is what has been kind of a lever to pull them apart.
Okay. Another question, if Hamlet is not at heart a man of action or decision, can he be considered a hero on any level? Mythical heroes take chances and make choices for the greater good. Was Shakespeare mocking his character as a modern man who doesn't believe in anything? In the end, does Hamlet reflect our human frailty and not the godlike heroes we aspire to emulate? There's a lot to unpack there.
I think that the play makes, I think Hamlet is heroic in the sense that he understands the difficulty of making decisions in a world in which, the world that is inherently ambiguous, that human persons have difficulty negotiating. But that's what Olivier says in the description. He's not really a hero. But the men of action in the play, Fortinbras and Laertes, neither of them are particularly attractive persons. The king says, "What would you do to avenge your father?" and Laertes said, "I slit his throat in a church." The men of action, the ones who just simply respond sort of as revenge heroes, or the heroes of revenge tragedy are meant to respond, they seem to be, less, at least to our time, less appealing. Fortinbras is taking innocent people off to get killed for no reason, for honor. It goes back to Falstaff's speech on honor in Henry IV. What's honor? Doesn't do you any good when you're blown to bits. And if the point is that, maybe Fortinbras comes home with honor as the commanding general, but what about all the people who get killed? That the place isn't big enough to bury them. And so I think the way I would read the play, then of course there's many different ways of reading the play. The way I would read the play is that Hamlet is the hero because he is sensitive enough to the ambiguities of the world, to the mysteries of the world, to the complexity of the world. And he doesn't go flying off with 20,000 souls to have a meaningless battle. But you see, I often say, the quarto version is our Hamlet for our time because he is the tormented existential hero, or if you like, the anti-hero of the play. Good question.
We're getting a lot of great questions. I don't know if we'll have time for them all, but I think if you don't mind, we certainly have time for a couple more.
Of course, of course.
Okay. Nietzsche said it was not that Hamlet thought too much, but that he thought too well. What do you think of the dramatic power of Hamlet's deliberations?
You mean in terms of on the stage, or yeah? Every actor. Well, I'm not sure I'm getting the question, but I'll take a shot at it this way. Every actor wants to play Hamlet. Why? Because you get to do all those wonderful soliloquies that are beautifully written and are very powerful and can really engage an audience on the stage. So I think that if you see if I put something else together real quickly. I've got to go back a minute. It's in Hamlet that we see Shakespeare bring to fullness his ability to dramatize interiority. Lots of critics point that out. That it starts with Christopher Marlowe. Shakespeare's contemporary, dies around 1594. Marlowe begins to build the kind of poetic line that makes possible the articulation of a mind in motion, a mind in action, in movement. Shakespeare develops what Marlowe begins and brings it to a kind of fullness, or to a kind of efficiency or effectiveness in Hamlet. So to be able to dramatize a mind in motion, is one of the great achievements of Shakespearean drama, and and I think it works on the stage anyway. I hope I got the question right.
Okay. Another question is, do you see similarities between Hamlet and Macbeth in their approach and problems to action versus inaction?
Yeah, well, yes, the trouble, I guess I would see some connectedness there. Macbeth is an action machine in the sense that he keeps doing things because he thinks that will free him from fear, or from being found out, if you like. When you see Macbeth, or you read it, you get the sense where he's saying, one more murder, then I can sleep at night. I don't have to worry anymore. Just one more. So he's on this kind of murder machine, murder treadmill, murdering in order to bring the action will bring resolution. For Hamlet, it's a kind of thought will bring resolution, or thought will bring this to the single action, which will then bring resolution and peace. So, but they are very different people, though, Macbeth and Hamlet, except, of course, somebody said that Macbeth would be just an ordinary criminal, indiscriminately killing people, except Shakespeare made him a great poet. So in some ways that we have in Macbeth as well, that famous speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace. Appropriate, that might be an appropriate speech for the time we live in now, creeps in this petty pace from day to day. That's great poetry. And that too is a way of articulating or of portraying interiority.
Another interesting question. It's a long one, so if you'll pardon.
Okay.
The length. Do you think that the inaction that we perceive in Hamlet could actually be bereavement? It is an emotion not frequently explored by Shakespeare, even in spite of the numerous characters he slayed and killed in his drama. Nowadays, we might diagnose his condition as complicated grief. Yet literary experts toil with the psychological complexities of the character without really delving into grief.
I think grief is certainly a component of Hamlet's character. I think it gets played out in the scene with the ghost. That's where the grieving is. We see him play. We see the grief played out. The last time they did the production, a production of Hamlet at the Shakespeare Theater here in Washington, an actor who had, well, it doesn't matter who the actor was, but in any case, at the very end of the scene with the ghost, Hamlet is kneeling down at the center stage, and the ghost turns around and begins to walk upstage, and then he stopped, and he turned around, and he came back, and Hamlet embraced him. It was the most beautiful thing, the father and the son there together, and it was very clear that one of the things, at least, that more than even this need for revenge was the terrible loss he felt for his father. Now, you can also argue that in many ways that the grief is driving him into this almost manic behavior that he sometimes takes on. So why is he jumping around? He's being a bad boy. He's acting out, we would say, if he was 12 years old, and the acting out is a result of the loss of his father, that he's just so that in some ways, anything he had to hold on to kind of philosophically is taken away from him with the death of his father. And he's then, just, he's trying to be disruptive at several points in the play.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll just do one last question. What is your favorite film version of Hamlet and why?
Bran is too long and he cheats. If you get a chance to look at that Act 4, Scene 4, How All Occasions Do Form Against Me, if you watch it, it's Branagh cheats. I like Branagh because he does the whole play. No, the one I like best is the old Richard Burton version that was filmed on Electronovision and was shown in movie theaters around the country in 1964. It's old, it's grainy, it's black and white, but I just like Burton. And he does that soliloquy, How All Occasions Do Form Against Me, just the way I want it done. It's really very, so I said, yeah, I would say that's, if you said I could only take one with me to a deserted or desert island, is it? I think I might take the Richard Burton version.
All right.
Yeah, can I say two things quick?
Of course.
Yeah, One is that we're lucky because YouTube this week is showing a National Theater version of Twelfth Night, which I saw and I thought was very good, very entertaining, very amusing. They turned Malvolio into Malvolia. A woman plays the role, but it's a woman who's a first-class actress. And then 2 weeks from now, YouTube, National Theater, again, YouTube, this time will put on Anthony and Cleopatra with Ralph Fiennes and Sophie Okonedo. It's great. So and each one runs for a week, Thursday to Thursday. This week, just go to YouTube and look for 12th Night, and then 2 weeks, Anthony and Cleopatra. I would really recommend them to you. And the other thing is, if you have a minute, the point I didn't get to make about Hamlet, which I would like to, you have a sheet in that material that was provided called Ethics in Practice. It's an outline of a article from the Harvard Business Review. Read number 5. I think there, the outline is numbered. Read just the 5th paragraph, and you'll see that I think that's kind of what is going on. I mean, that's how Hamlet, in a sense, speaks to us in our time as we struggle to make serious human decisions that have serious human consequences. Okay, I'll shut up now.
No, don't. I'm sorry, that we have to end here. There are, still questions rolling in, and hellos from a number of former students, but we will surely follow up with the information that you referenced. And thank you again, Mike, for taking the time to present to the community, and for this insightful and delightful presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation and will join upcoming programs. Please look out for our follow-up email, which will include more information on upcoming events, as well as that feedback survey and a link to today's recording. With that, hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their week. Thank you so much, Professor Collins.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.